Mark is 53 years old, and tonight, like most nights, he is sitting alone in a garage that no longer smells like sawdust. The overhead light hums. On the shelf behind him sits a trophy from a regional sales conference, half covered in dust, next to a photograph of a promotion ceremony he can barely remember feeling anything at. His phone lights up with a notification, a LinkedIn congratulations for 25 years of service. He looks at it for 3 seconds, then sets the phone face down on the workbench. Outside, the neighborhood is quiet. Somewhere down the street a dog barks once and stops. Mark exhales, the kind of exhale that isn't relief, just release. He built a career. He built a house. He built a family that now lives its own separate life in its own separate rooms. And somehow, on a Tuesday night in a garage that used to mean something, none of it is enough to make the silence feel like peace instead of absence. This is a scene many men will recognize instantly, even if the garage is a study, a truck cab, or a back porch instead. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. Mark wakes up early, out of habit more than purpose now. He checks numbers, bank balances, retirement projections, sometimes just the weather, because checking things feels like control, and control has always felt like safety. He goes through his day competently, sometimes impressively, and comes home to do it again. He rarely complains, because complaining requires naming a feeling, and naming a feeling requires sitting still with it first. He measures his days in tasks completed, not moments felt. When someone asks how he's doing, he says, "Can't complain," and means it literally, not that things are good, but that complaining was never really an option he was given. He has succeeded by every external measure society handed him. And yet there's a quiet, persistent question that surfaces at 2 a.m. or during long drives. Is this what it was supposed to feel like? This pattern didn't appear from nowhere. Gen X men were raised inside a very specific cultural instruction manual, one that rewarded stoicism, independence, and provision as the primary currencies of masculine worth. Their fathers often worked long hours and said little about what any of it cost them emotionally. Their mothers, in many households, absorbed the emotional labor so the men in the family never had to learn it themselves. Society taught an entire generation of boys that value was proven through output, through paychecks, promotions, mortgages paid on time, roofs that didn't leak. Nobody sat them down and asked what they wanted to feel by 50. They were asked what they wanted to build. Friendship, for many of these men, shrank quietly over the decades, not through any single dramatic loss, but through 1,000 small substitutions of connection for productivity. The Sunday phone calls stopped. The poker nights disbanded once kids and careers filled the calendar. What remained were transactional relationships, co-workers, in-laws, acquaintances at the gym, pleasant, but rarely intimate. Research on adult male friendship consistently shows the same trend. The older men get, the smaller and shallower their circle becomes, even as their responsibilities grow larger. Achievement became the substitute language for love, because it was the only language many of these men were ever fluently taught. To understand why this happens, you have to go back further than the resume, back to childhood, where the blueprint was quietly drawn. Many of these men grew up in households where emotional expression was treated as either irrelevant or dangerous. Dangerous because it exposed weakness, irrelevant because it didn't put food on the table. A boy who cried too easily was told to toughen up. A boy who asked for comfort too often was gently, or not so gently, redirected towards self-sufficiency instead. Over time, the nervous system adapts. Vulnerability starts to register not as an invitation for closeness but as a threat to be managed and minimized. Achievement, on the other hand, was reliably praised. Grades were praised. Promotions were praised. A steady paycheck was praised. So a boy learns, without ever consciously deciding to, that his worth is conditional on output, and that emotional needs are, at best, a private inconvenience. This becomes a coping mechanism disguised as a personality trait. Self-reliance isn't just a value for these men, it's a defense system. Built brick by brick out of every moment love felt safer when earned through performance than when simply given. And defense systems are notoriously difficult to dismantle because they worked. They kept the boy safe. The tragedy is that the same system that protected the child now isolates the man. There's a twist most people miss when they look at men like Mark from the outside. The ones who seem the most composed are often carrying the heaviest silence. Co-workers describe him as reliable, easygoing, the guy who never causes drama. Family describes him as steady, dependable, the rock. Nobody describes him as struggling, because struggling was never a role he auditioned for. And this is precisely the trap. Competence becomes camouflage. The better a man performs the role of fine, the less anyone around him thinks to check underneath it. His own wife, who loves him, sometimes assumes his quietness is contentment rather than distance, because he has never given her reason to assume otherwise. That is not her failure. It is the predictable result of 30 years of a man training everyone around him, including himself, to read silence as strength instead of what it often actually is, a held breath that never gets released. Here is where the real contradiction lives, and it is not simple. These men want connection, genuinely, deeply, but they have spent decades practicing the exact opposite skill. They miss friendship, yet they don't call, because calling requires initiating vulnerability without a guaranteed return, and that feels riskier than it should. They crave being understood, yet they hide the very information that would allow anyone to understand them. Ask Mark how he's really doing, and he will answer with a project update instead of a feeling. This isn't dishonesty. It's fluency. He is answering in the only language that ever felt safe to speak. Men in this position often mistake the absence of conflict for the presence of peace, when really it's just the absence of anyone close enough to create friction. They will drive 4 hours to help a friend move without hesitation, but they won't send a text saying, "I've been having a hard time lately." Physical effort feels earned and understandable. Emotional disclosure feels like exposure with no clear purpose. So the contradiction repeats itself on a loop. Craving closeness, defending against the very act that would produce it. And because achievement has always delivered predictable, measurable rewards, a bonus, a title, a completed renovation, it becomes the default coping mechanism whenever the ache of disconnection surfaces. Chase another goal. Fix another problem. Outrun the feeling instead of naming it. There's another twist buried inside the pattern, one that rarely gets said plainly. Many of these men aren't actually afraid of vulnerability itself. They're afraid of being vulnerable and still not being met. As boys, some of them tried, they cried, they asked, they reached, and were met with impatience or dismissal, or a joke that stung more than it should have. So the lesson wasn't never feel. The lesson was, feeling didn't work last time, so why risk it again? That single reframe changes everything. It means the wall wasn't built out of coldness. It was built out of disappointment, repeated enough times that self-protection started to look identical to indifference from the outside, even though on the inside it never stopped aching. But there's a subtler layer beneath even that. What happens when the achievements stop producing the relief they once did? This is often the real turning point for men in their 50s. The promotion that used to bring 3 weeks of satisfaction now brings 3 hours. The house renovation is finished, admired, and within days it's just a house again. Somewhere along the way, achievement stopped being fuel and became maintenance, a way of staying afloat rather than a way of feeling alive. And this raises an uncomfortable question that most of these men have never said out loud, maybe not even to themselves. If everything I built was supposed to prove my worth, why do I still feel like I have to keep proving it? Is the emptiness a sign that something is broken in him, or is it a signal, an honest, overdue signal, that the entire framework he was handed was incomplete from the start? What if the goal was never actually happiness, but approval disguised as happiness? What if the drive he mistook for ambition was, quietly, always the search for a kind of acceptance he was never taught how to ask for directly? There is no clean resolution to any of this, and pretending otherwise would betray the truth of what these men actually experience. The human truth sitting underneath all of it is this: achievement and connection were never supposed to be substitutes for one another, yet an entire generation of men was raised as though they were interchangeable. Provision was mistaken for intimacy. Competence was mistaken for closeness. And so many men reached the middle of their lives holding an impressive stack of proof, a career, a house, a family that depended on them, only to discover that proof was never the same thing as being known. Being known requires something achievement can't offer: the willingness to be seen without a scoreboard attached. That willingness doesn't arrive automatically with age or success. Sometimes it never arrives at all, and the man simply learns to live alongside the quiet instead of resolving it. Mark is still in the garage. The light still hums. He picks his phone back up, scrolls past the notification, and for a moment his thumb hovers over an old contact, someone he hasn't spoken to in 11 years, a friend from a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. He doesn't call. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. Maybe never, and he'll tell himself that's fine too, because telling himself things are fine has always been one of his most practiced skills. He turns off the garage light and walks back into a house full of people he loves and doesn't quite know how to talk to. Somewhere between the trophy on the shelf and the silence in the hallway is a version of Mark that never got to ask what he actually wanted, only what he was supposed to build. That version is still in there. He just hasn't been introduced to himself yet.